Major funding for this program provided by the Russell Family Foundation. Additional support provided by the Bates Family Foundation and the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation, and by CHI Franciscan Health and the Multicare Health System, and contributions to KBTC Public Television by viewers like you. Thank you.
It began with bullying and intimidation. There were political cartoons depicting the Chinese as pigs and as heathens. The U.S. government even took legal action against them, and anti-Chinese violence became commonplace across the West. The Washington Territory was no exception. When the factory whistle blew on November 3, 1885, Tacoma's leaders drove the Chinese out of town.
Well, it was not our finest hour as a city. The leaders of Tacoma, the mayor, the police chief, the prosecutor, basically the establishment, for the most part decided that it was time to expel the Chinese residents from our city. So they went down to the waterfront where many of them had homes, took them out of their homes, burned them to the ground, put them on trains, and told them to leave our city. It was a very sad, tragic event, and it's one of the reasons that Tacoma, for a pretty large city on the West Coast, does not have a Chinatown.
In the summer of 1885, there were as many as 700 Chinese that lived in Tacoma. By year's end, they were all but gone. Today, Tacoma is an international port city with a population of more than 200,000. And yet, there are still only about 700 Chinese that live here. To understand why means exploring the history of the American West and the Chinese immigrants who were part of it. The 1800s were turbulent times in southern China. The Chinese people were suffering. When word of the California gold rush reached Chinese ports, men began boarding ships bound for San Francisco.
In China, there were literally hundreds of years of problems that were taking place within the country. It revolved around everything from internal civil wars to the Opium Wars with Great Britain. There were problems with famine. A number of ports were ceded over to Great Britain. So the Chinese who had worked on docks and within the ports couldn't even get jobs.
There are lots of European and American ships in southern China already, and they bring news of the gold rush. And that's really how the gold rush became the gold rush. Everybody around the world heard about it.
In the early American West, when gold was discovered, it brought a huge influx of population from across the globe. Aside from the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, everybody was a foreigner. If you were a Chinese individual, you were just one of many people, and everybody was a stranger in a strange land.
But the Chinese would quickly learn that in this land of opportunity, not everyone thought all immigrants were created equal.
When the Chinese began moving into the United States in the 1840s, 1850s, there are lots of public debates about slavery. This idea that God had even created separate races from the very beginning, that they were unequal.
History records the Chinese being viewed as the most foreign of them all. People looked at them as individuals who dressed differently. The way that they would wear their hair, they wore the queues. The way that they spoke, the language was clearly something that most people would not have any idea what was being said.
People felt that somehow the Chinese quality of life degraded everybody else, that their customs were unacceptable, they weren't Christian.
You get this population that it reinforces their foreignness because they're sticking to themselves. They're not, becoming Americanized and all this stuff. Well, how could they? So, and in addition, they were an easy target because they look different. History is written by the victors. And in a lot of instances, that unfortunately was not the Chinese migrants that came here and helped build the West.
Initially, they were welcomed. Even the governor of California welcomed the Chinese, but very quickly, the tone shifts, and the Chinese are represented as unfair competition, and they begin passing laws specifically against the Chinese. One of the very first laws that the state legislature in California passed was a foreign miners tax, and that targeted the Chinese in particular. I think estimates are that within the first 3 decades, from the 1850s to the 1880s, Chinese contributed something like 25% of the state revenue from those taxes.
Oregon had a tax similar to the one in California. The counties made quite a bit of money off these foreign miners at the time. Other ways they were targeted was you couldn't buy land unless you lived in Oregon at the time of statehood. So if you were a Chinese individual that came later, you couldn't buy land, which limited what you could do. A lot of places you couldn't stake a mining claim, so you had to buy it from someone else, which meant you could sometimes get a lower quality mining claim. You couldn't have a business without paying a huge fee. You couldn't get married. So all these different aspects of people's lives that translate into building lives and making somewhere your home, there was an obstacle at every turn.
Jacksonville, Oregon got its start as a gold rush town in 1851. The Chinese flocked here and established Oregon's first Chinatown. The Chinese found solace here from the discrimination they were facing from white miners and lawmakers.
Chinatowns were established even in these tiny little mining communities, in part because of some of these discriminatory measures, but also they served as community hubs. You had people mining all over the mountains outside of town, and the Chinese Quarter was somewhere where you could come in and buy goods. You could connect with some people you knew. You could help find work. You could write letters home. You could gamble. You could do all these different activities on the weekends or holidays. The Chinese neighborhoods were a really important resource for folks.
Chinatown provided a family that you didn't have. This was a population that was overwhelmingly male. 95% of all of the Chinese who were living in the United States were living on the West Coast. And the majority of the Chinese were represented by single males or males who were married but without their families.
And so it isn't at all surprising that the entertainments for this group of men included the occasional prostitute, that included things like Chinese opera and gambling, some opium use, that these were recreations for a male population, which is not unlike other male populations that we still see in the world.
Most of the Chinese came from the southern Chinese province of Guangdong and spoke little, if any, English. They were hired through labor contractors.
They're like labor brokers, employment agents that would contract with big businesses and corporate concerns in the United States. So they would act as the intermediary to find the Chinese workers and then bring them over to the U.S. And as part of that, it was called the credit ticket system. The Chinese would borrow some of the passage money that they would need, and then it would be paid back in portions as they worked for whatever that corporate concern was or whatever that business was. The Chinese who did speak English, those were the individuals who would end up being more powerful within the Chinese communities.
These were merchants. These were entrepreneurs who were opening laundries, provisioning stores, hotels, restaurants, and some of the most important of them would become the major labor contractors. These were individuals who were basically intending to rise in the social structure, and indeed they did.
But the vast majority of the Chinese were laborers.
This region in southern China had a long history of sending people overseas as sojourners to earn money and then send a portion of it back home. And that was the case in the gold fields and later in the railroad.
What I like to emphasize, rather than their sojourner mentality, is that they were really treated like migrant workers. That is, they were welcomed for their labor, but not welcomed as permanent residents, as potential citizens. So lots of Chinese would work in agriculture in California, and then they would move north with the seasonal changes, work in the canneries as far north as Alaska, but it began in Oregon and Washington.
Astoria, Oregon had several canneries in the late 1800s. Pier 39 is home to the founding cannery for the Bumblebee Seafood Corporation.
It was the second cannery built in Astoria in 1875, and so about that time the Chinese were hired as laborers. In the mid-1800s, there was about 2,500 Chinese in Astoria, and so they did everything from butchering fish to cleaning the guts to working, packing all the salt urns and querns here in the cannery. Well, the canneries worked 24/7, and there was no labor laws back then. So, you know, if you read the early morning Astorian from the 1800s, you can see just the writing about the Chinese definitely made them a lot different than you and I today as where we're treated. Dogs, the Chinese dog, you know, and they're talking about the Chinese themselves, or the coolies.
Coolie labor, well, the term itself is an Asian Indian term. It's a Hindu term that means literally bitter labor.
Now, it's a term that's thrust on the Chinese workers. That is, they were somehow naturally slavish or enslaved. They weren't.
We identify coolie laborers as being something that is more affiliated with being shanghaied or stolen out of China and then put into other jobs or other laboring positions. So the Chinese that were shanghaied in China and taken directly to Peru, they were essentially, we're looking at slave labor. So the term itself is really not one, I don't believe it's one that really accurately describes the Chinese experience in North America.
What is accurate, though, is the vital role they played in building our railroad infrastructure. In 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act, authorizing the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. But there was a shortage of white labor out west, so Central Pacific hired thousands of Chinese.
They were incredibly hard workers. The reputation with respect to hiring the Chinese was that they were not prone to strike, which automatically made them diametrically different from many other immigrant groups who were hired to work on the railroads. These were individuals that they could literally work to their death and pay them pennies for the kind of work that they did.
Well, the Central Pacific was blocked by the Sierra Nevada mountains, building the railroad through these granite cliffs. And the work was so hard that it was going very slow. They had a hard time recruiting white workers. They did find white workers, but there were not enough. And they often quit. They would work for a while, as I understand it, get a paycheck and disappear. And the Chinese had this reputation for working very hard.
The conditions in the Sierra Nevadas proved to be so severe that the Chinese actually did stage a work stoppage.
So in the spring of 1867, 2,000 of them, they were way up in the mountains. They waged a strike. They wanted equal wages with the white workers. And Central Pacific dug in their heels, and Charles Crocker said, "We will not give in to the Chinese," and they just cut off the food supply. And the Chinese were forced to give up their strike. But, it's significant that they wanted something better, and they did something about it.
I think at the end of the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, of the 13,000 working on the western leg, 11,000 of them were Chinese. I don't think they got much recognition at the end of that for what they did.
But that's not to say the Chinese haven't been recognized at all. They have. Among other things, at the Golden Spike National Historic Site, you'll find this sign, which salutes the Chinese for laying 10 miles of track in one day during Central Pacific's final push. In 1868, the U.S. and China signed the Burlingame-Seward Treaty to help facilitate trade and allow Chinese to immigrate and travel freely within the United States. It also promised that the Chinese would be protected while they were here.
It's in a time of economic prosperity. This was the opportunity to build strong cities and to build a strong transportation infrastructure system in the United States. And all of it kind of came to a serious halt around 1873.
Well, there is a widespread depression across the United States. A lot of people are out of work, including the Chinese.
You've got about 10,000 Chinese workers. They're all unemployed. They're unemployed at the same time that everybody else who was working on the rail lines they're also unemployed.
White workers, and this really defined the labor movement on the West Coast, began targeting the Chinese. They began blaming the Chinese for this widespread depression.
And the Chinese start to become the targets because they were willing to work for so little money. So with respect to corporations, mining companies, spur railroad lines, if you wanted to work with these same corporations, you had to be willing to accept the low amount of salary, the low amount of pay that would be on par with the Chinese. So organized labor became very, very interested in who is really to blame for driving the wages down.
California had by far the largest population of Chinese in the country, and labor leader Dennis Carney helped fuel the anti-Chinese fire. His scathing speeches on San Francisco's sandlots often ended with, quote, "Whatever happens, the Chinese must go." That fiery rhetoric helped spark a two-day race riot that killed 4 Chinese and caused more than $100,000 in damages. Carney's efforts also helped convince California lawmakers to amend the state's constitution in 1879. Article 19 prohibited companies from hiring Chinese or Mongolians. State agencies could only use Chinese workers as punishment for crimes, and Asiatic coolieism was declared an act of slavery and prohibited. But the labor unions didn't stop there. They took their act on the road.
Organized labor kind of sold the idea of the need for national legislation, because if the United States had some piece of legislation that was going to prevent the Chinese from coming in, then the incidences of violence would somehow be curtailed because the Chinese would no longer be coming into the U.S.
Congress gave in and passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
The Chinese Exclusion Act is the very first law targeting a racially based group, restricting their immigration into the United States, and it was on the books until 1943.
Chinese exclusion was really focused on preventing skilled and unskilled laborers from coming into the United States. It did allow exempt classes, so if you were a merchant, a scholar, a diplomat, you could still come into the United States.
The exclusion law suddenly legitimized racism.
The Chinese Exclusion Act helps to create the idea that immigration is something that needs to be policed. Basically, I think it sets the stage for this idea that there are people who are desirable and there are people who are undesirable. And there are people who can become Americans and there are people who cannot become Americans.
It's basically legally sanctioned discrimination and violence towards Chinese migrants living in the West. And that's when life gets really difficult for folks.
And in Seattle and Tacoma, basically white vigilante mobs begin attacking Chinese residents.
In October of 1885, Tacoma's Chinese residents were given less than 1 month to get out of town. The majority left, but on November 3rd, as many as 200 remained. That's when Mayor Robert Jacob Weisbach led an angry mob of whites through the streets to round them up. The action had clearly been scripted ahead of time.
When that whistle went off, everybody would break from work or whatever they were doing and would in a supposedly an orderly manner, would gather downtown. It was raining. It was just a crummy November day. The mob assembled in the street and just systematically moved back and forth across the city.
And there were two areas where the Chinese were living. One was near the Old Town area, but there was also an area of land that was leased by the Chinese, and the land was owned by the Northern Pacific Railroad.
There wasn't an intention, like a lynch mob, to necessarily do any harm to anybody, but they weren't going to take no for an answer.
They were going to basically gather up all of the Chinese who were living in Tacoma, transport them to a railroad station in Lakeview, which was that station was about 8 miles south of the core of Tacoma.
Pretty unrelenting results. The Chinese were just brought out of their homes. In most cases, they weren't allowed to bring anything with them, and they were just really literally herded.
And by this time, it's night, it's cold, it's raining. Some of the Chinese that they took out of the Chinatown area were ill, and they had to wait overnight for the train to come.
Those that could afford it were told to buy a ticket south to Portland, and the others were loaded on freight cars.
But not before 2 Chinese reportedly died from exposure during the night. No one knows exactly how many Chinese made it all the way to Oregon, but the consensus is a lot of them did. Lum May was a successful Tacoma merchant who would later testify about what happened, how the Chinese were only given until 1:30 to pack up and leave, how doors and windows were smashed in, how the mob was armed with pistols and clubs, and how his wife lost her reason and threatened to kill people with a hatchet or anything else she could get a hold of, and ultimately how he had been utterly ruined by the experience. Word of the expulsion spread, but not fast enough to stop it.
By the time that all of this word had reached the sheriff in King County and the mayor of Seattle and the territorial governor, Chinatown in Tacoma was already on fire. The following day, the second Chinatown area, or the area that they had leased from the Northern Pacific Railroad, was also set afire. So Chinatown literally, not figuratively, but literally, was completely obliterated before the territorial governor had even had an opportunity to act.
The Tacoma story went to San Francisco and Chicago and was reprinted, and as it got outside of Tacoma, it quickly became characterized as the Tacoma method by journalists in other communities. It was the first time that you had a vigilante action like this, led by a mayor, led by a judge, Judge Wickersham. I mean, people that are prominent, high-ranking members of the community.
The expulsion's leaders were known as the Committee of 15. Part of their self-proclaimed agenda included strong-arming businesses and citizens. On October 8th, just shy of 1 month before the expulsion, the committee sent out a letter urging businesses and people not to hire and to fire Chinese. Several Tacoma newspapers backed the committee, especially the Tacoma Daily Ledger and its editor, Jack Comerford.
The Ledger was one of the more anti-establishment newspapers in town at the day that was always critical of the railroad and the big institutions in town, was very much backed by the saloon keepers and the labor unions. I mean, we had anarchists and communists and all those kind of radical idea people in town, and they tended to read the Ledger, and the Ledger was, Comerford with the Ledger was deeply racist.
Mayor Weisbach had risen to power in Tacoma in short order. He was new to the Washington Territory, a German immigrant, a socialist, and anarchist.
Which makes it kind of interesting when you think about what he was, or the position that he had politically with the city, but also his personal interest to try to make sure that Tacoma was going to be completely free of any of the Chinese.
His anti-Chinese message had attracted a wide following.
There was an effort to try to unify anti-Chinese movement in a convention that was held in Seattle, and Weisbach was elected the chairman of this larger group that was the entire Puget Sound area.
There were representatives from basically all of the surrounding counties and cities that they came into Seattle, and they were talking about this Chinese menace that they had to deal with.
The convention was sponsored by the Washington Knights of Labor Union, which had a loose affiliation with the National Knights of Labor.
Daniel Cronin was with the Knights of Labor, and he was actually one of the perpetrators who worked directly with Tacoma's mayor. There were a number of meetings that were taking place in Tacoma. They didn't really start to happen in Seattle until around the end of September, but Tacoma was well on its way to coming up with a plan to get rid of the Chinese.
We don't know all of the private secret meetings that were held. The most militant of the anti-Chinese definitely met in secret strategic meetings to build their numbers, but then they would have these big sort of performance things that were meant for larger audiences. The ideas that came out of them were very unsatisfying for the more militant anti-Chinese.
That's where they did come face to face with some opposition from prominent people like Ezra Meeker and former Mayor John Wilson Sprague.
Well, Ezra Meeker is one of those singular characters. He seems to be everywhere. He came very, very early, came over the Oregon Trail. Mayor Sprague had been a high-ranking official with the NP. He was a Civil War veteran. He was the mayor immediately prior to Weisbach. He as well, like Ezra Meeker, was absolutely outspoken.
But they were some of the few dissenting voices.
Tacoma had a really strong cadre of individuals, and it's interesting because they either were against the Chinese being in the city, or they were people who were kind of indifferent to it. And because of their indifference, they would not speak up for the Chinese situation either. So they pretty much had carte blanche to get rid of these individuals.
27 agitators were ultimately arrested for the expulsion and taken to Vancouver, Washington to stand trial. Bond was set at $5,000 each.
And they're thinking that this is just a tremendous sum of money. There is no possible way that each one of these individuals is going to be able to come up with this. By the time these individuals leave the federal court and come back to Tacoma, the money had already been collected. They collected $137,000 to post bail for these individuals, and they were never convicted.
One person who was indicted and avoided being taken into custody was Comerford, who was named, and was a warrant was issued for him, and he had run.
Once the Chinese had been driven out of Tacoma, focus shifted to anti-Chinese rumblings in Seattle.
Seattle's mayor, the sheriff of King County, the territorial governor weren't really sure what to do because they had just witnessed what had taken place in Tacoma. At that point, the territorial governor realizes that they're kind of over their head, because if this kind of thing could happen in Tacoma so quickly, now the focus was on Seattle, because Cronin was also in Seattle. And they make the decision that they're going to have to send for federal troops. And so they have to literally get permission from the President of the United States to have the militia and the infantry from Vancouver come to Seattle.
President Cleveland signed an executive order and martial law was declared. The troops stayed in Seattle from November 1885 through January 1886.
And they end up staying here from post-Tacoma expulsion and into January, when people start to kind of breathe a sigh of relief that maybe this isn't going to happen in Seattle. So they send the infantry back to Vancouver. And about that time, they start to notice that there is a more of a fevered pitch that is taking place with the expulsionists in Seattle to get rid of the Chinese.
On February 7th, a group of men believed to be members of the Knights of Labor posed as health inspectors and entered Seattle's Chinatown looking for Chinese.
They gather up all of the Chinese in Chinatown and take them to one of the warehouses that's at the dock. So you have literally all of these Chinese that are freezing to death in the warehouse on the dock, awaiting to board the Pacific Queen to be taken to San Francisco. And the only thing that the city is relying on literally are deputies that have been sworn in by the sheriff. And together, this kind of motley crew of soldiers were charged with protecting the Chinese and protecting Chinatown from violence. In the meantime, there is just such a scramble. The captain wasn't going to take any passengers that did not have passage paid. So literally, before the Chinese can board the ship, they take up a collection to pay for as many passages as they possibly can.
Judge Thomas Burke had held up the expulsion for a day before the ship set off for San Francisco with a majority of the Chinese on board. But there were still a number of Chinese remaining.
And so they marched them back into Chinatown, and that's when things become really violent. It ends up with at least one person being killed. The Chinese end up literally hitting the ground to try to protect themselves, and there is just this mass mob and riot that is taking place within the city streets of Seattle.
A month later, radical elements tried driving the Chinese out of Portland. Their efforts were put down, but that doesn't mean the city was all embracing.
I don't know to really just at what degree Portland was more hospitable than other cities. I think that's all relative. I mean, there were certainly pockets of violence. There were Chinese worker camps in Albina, in Milwaukee, Mount Tabor that were burned to the ground and their residents forced to flee. So we know that there was hostility. The governor of Oregon was very much opposed to Chinese immigration. He didn't protect those who were being harassed and harried out.
The Oregonian newspaper's editor-in-chief, Harvey Scott, helped to put things into perspective.
Harvey Scott supported keeping the Chinese here. One of his arguments was that the Chinese should not be driven. They're doing work that whites won't do. We need them. There was a lot of agitation, a lot of anti-Chinese violence, but the fact is that Chinese remained.
It's interesting I think to think about the connection with what was taking place throughout the greater Pacific Northwest. In a lot of ways, it actually started with what was taking place in Rock Springs. And all of this was revolving around miners that were being paid very little money. And I'm going to say the high number of Chinese miners that outnumbered the Caucasian miners by about 2 to 1. And it had finally reached a level of, I'm going to say, irritation and aggravation.
The Caucasian miners were threatening the company with unionizing. The Chinese weren't involved in that. They had no interest in that. They just wanted to go to do their work and go home. They decided that they had had enough of the Chinese. They were here, they were different, they had odd customs, they were not going to unionize, they were just here to take their jobs.
Things came to a head on September 2nd, 1885.
What started out as a minor skirmish ended up becoming a major incident.
The problem started at mine number 6 in Rock Springs, and there were 10 mines in the downtown area. There was a fight underground, and one of the Chinese were killed.
Union Pacific promptly closed the mines for the day and told everyone to go home and cool off.
Well, instead of going home, all the Caucasian miners went to the bars in town, of which there were plenty. And I think that that's where probably the union organizers were there too. They finally got together, all the bars got together, and they ended up spilling out into the street from all over, and a mob formed. This mob sent word to Chinatown and said, you have until 6 o'clock tonight to get out of town, then we're coming to burn Chinatown down.
They didn't wait nearly that long.
They went into Chinatown and started shooting and burning the houses down.
28 Chinese were murdered and another 15 injured in one of the worst racially charged riots the American West has ever seen. Hundreds of Chinese fled into the nearby hills.
They were put on trains to take them away. They went to Evanston.
But unlike Tacoma, the Chinese came back.
Yeah, and they came back a week later. Federal troops were sent in here after the riot, and we were occupied for 14 years. It's unfortunate no one was prosecuted.
If you look closely, you can still find remnants of Old Rock Springs. A few of the town's original structures sit alongside an unimproved alleyway. Another building thought to be an original is located in the old Chinatown area. There's also a Catholic church there where Chinese homes were. Fort Pilot Butte is now a parking lot. Mine 6 was filled in long ago. It's now just an open field. Down the road in Reliance, there's an abandoned mine shaft and the Reliance Tipple, where coal was loaded onto rail cars.
Rock Springs has always been known in the state of Wyoming as the wild and woolly town of the West. During the 1970s, when the first oil boom came in, the energy boom, it was a wild town, and that's when 60 Minutes did the expose on Rock Springs as the most corrupt town in America. And I think now that it's kind of come back to just a very quiet Western town.
Issaquah, Washington is nestled up against the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, about 18 miles east of Seattle. In the 1800s, it was known as Squaw Valley. Today, Issaquah is mostly a middle-class community, but the town does have its own sordid past. Several Chinese hop pickers were killed here along Issaquah Creek, just days after the Rock Springs riot. The Chinese had been brought in to work for the Wold brothers.
The Wold brothers were a group of Norwegian farmers who moved to the Squaw Valley area, and they began farming hops. Usually what they did was they contracted with the Native American hop pickers, but that year the hop prices had fallen, and they wanted to try and negotiate a lower rate for picking the hops. The Native Americans in the area weren't willing to do that. So on Saturday, September 5th, 1885, a group of Chinese laborers came out and pitched camp on the Wold property. Later that evening, a group of white residents of Squaw Valley came to see the Wolds and told them that they needed to send the Chinese laborers away.
But the Wolds refused.
On the evening of Monday, September 7th, a group of whites, along with 2 Native Americans, approached the Wold camp and fired into the tents that were housing the Chinese workers. This was sometime between 9 and 10 at night. 6 of the Chinese workers were shot. 3 of them died. These people were brought on trial for murder, and things were made a little bit easier for the prosecution because one of the men who had been with the group attacking the Chinese laborers, Samuel Robertson, decided to testify against the others. George Tibbets, Sam said, had been the source of the ammunition, which is very interesting because Tibbets was also the Justice of the Peace.
Tibbets and the other men were charged with murder but found not guilty. The prosecutor then charged them with inciting a riot. They were convicted of that and fined $500 each, but they appealed.
The Territorial Superior Court said, well, wait a minute. You had a grand jury, but you had women on the grand jury, and women are not able to vote in Washington Territory. Therefore, they're not eligible to serve on grand juries, so the whole proceeding was null and void. So technically, a handful of people were convicted of inciting riot, but they never had to actually pay any fee or suffer any actual punishment.
During the winter of 1885, gunfights between rival Chinese Tongs in Eureka, California, had become commonplace.
On February 5th, City Councilman David Kendall was returning home after his evening meal when he fell victim to a stray bullet. He succumbed to his wounds after being taken to his home that night. And a crowd of unemployed lumbermen, mostly Eureka residents, gathered within hours.
The lumbermen seized on Kendall's death as an excuse to blame the Chinese for taking their jobs.
They had discussed the option of either running the Chinese into the woods and looting and destroying Chinatown, or murdering them outright. Neither of these happened, probably because of the actions of Sheriff Brown. Reverend Huntington of Eureka also spoke out against the whites.
The Chinese were given until 3 p.m. the next day to pack up, then wagons were brought in to take them to the dock.
There were already 2 ships in the harbor waiting for them. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but it seems a little strange to me. By the next morning, they had erected a gallows. No one was hung. One man he came pretty close. They had him on the gallows. There were over 200 Chinese in Eureka at the time. By April of that year, they say that most of them had left. There are exceptions. There was a Chinese gentleman by the name of Charlie Moon who lived up on a place called the Bear Ranch, and he lived there for the rest of his life.
When the Chinese came to this country, they did not want to be buried here. It's part of the Chinese faith that they needed to be buried in their home villages where their relatives could tend to them. If they should die and remain in this country, their spirits would be wandering around for eternity. And so the Chinese organizations which helped to organize them when they came to this country periodically would go to graveyards around the country where it was known that Chinese would be buried, remove the remains, they would be cleansed, then they would be boxed up in tin boxes, and those boxes would be returned to China. Sadly, because of the turmoil in China, many of those boxes are now in warehouses in Hong Kong. The Baker City Cemetery is probably the most interesting to illustrate on this. It's just a marvelous facility that was quite discovered by happenstance because the developer wanted to widen a road. And in checking the title, he discovered the Chinese cemetery. There was once a large community of Chinese in Baker City, working on the railroads, mining in the region. Credit the Baker County Historical Society. They worked with the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Portland. Young Chinese came up from Portland. They cleared the area. They put paths through it. They found the indentations where bodies had been removed and returned to China.
Greg Noakes has been researching the Chinese for years. He wrote a book titled Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon, about a group of Chinese miners that were murdered in 1887.
Well, I learned in, I think it was 1995, of this massacre that occurred up in Wallowa County in northeastern Oregon, where a group of horse thieves were charged with killing 10 Chinese and let go. So I began to research this for the paper, did a story that was pretty well received, and continued my research when I discovered there were as many as 36 Chinese killed, and nobody was held accountable. Plus, what was even more disturbing is they were robbed of their gold, but then the killers killed them and threw their bodies into the river. Well, this was a remote area, a Hell's Canyon, where hardly anybody ever went. The killers could just as easily have taken their gold and let them go. But the fact that they killed them told me it was a savage act of racial hatred, and I wanted to track that story down. And that became the book. And then I began to learn of other things, like what happened in Tacoma, what happened in Northern California, what happened in Seattle, what happened in Portland, the Chinese, and realized it was this mosaic of anti-Chinese bias.
Betty Luke is a diversity trainer and civil rights advocate in Seattle. She met Greg while they were both attending a get-together with community leaders in Idaho to talk about the Hell's Canyon murders.
This group of community leaders in Lewiston, Idaho, brought Greg Noakes in. They created teacher training. They created a field trip over to where the crisis occurred. They even worked with renaming the area Chinese Massacre Cove.
Well, June 22nd, 2012, we installed a memorial at the site of the massacre, and it was a Taoist ceremony.
It was so impressive because not only did they have the acknowledgement in English, but they had in Chinese, and they had in Nez Perce, because that's the original inhabitants of the land. And so it was a tri-cultural event.
It's important to note this is not a marker for tourists, to go to just to see. It's really almost like a grave marker for those who perished there.
Not everywhere in the West was overly hostile towards the Chinese. Case in point, Fort Townsend, Washington. In the late 1800s, Fort Townsend was a customs port with an active Chinatown along Washington Street. There were anti-Chinese problems here, but for the most part, whites and Chinese got along.
The Chinese in the Fort Townsend area really were working side by side with some of the other immigrants into Washington State, and they became very important because the Chinese provided goods and services.
Gloria's great-grandfather immigrated here legally as a merchant after Chinese exclusion and married a young Chinese woman from Oregon. But there were also plenty of illegal Chinese here. Nearby North Beach helped support a lucrative smuggling trade.
In the earliest days, Port Townsend was the custom stop for shipping coming into Puget Sound, and so smugglers would have had to duck Port Townsend, or would have, if they were bringing in opium or Chinese contract laborers, whatever, after 1882, they would have had to get around Port Townsend, or in some cases just go right through.
Some of the Chinese worked here, growing food in the Chinese gardens and living a relatively peaceful life in what were otherwise turbulent times in the American West.
I've been in journalism a long time and traveled a lot of places around the world as a journalist and seen a lot of violence. So I could say that I learned how ugly we can be to our fellow man. But I knew that. I'd seen it in many, many places. So that wasn't new. But somebody raised in Oregon, it was surprising to me to learn that we were part of that ugliness. Plus, we didn't want to recognize it.
It's only in recent years that formal apologies about the treatment of Chinese in California, the treatment of the Chinese in Washington State, it's all in very recent years that formal apologies have even been given. And I'm going to say not just apologies, but also recognition for the work that they did.
Several U.S. cities are making efforts to recognize the Chinese and to apologize for how they were treated. Denver has placed a plaque where its anti-Chinese riot took place. Astoria has the Garden of Surging Waves, a beautiful park that celebrates the Chinese efforts to build the city. And in 2016, the people of Rock Springs dedicated a monument to the 28 Chinese miners that were murdered. But are efforts like these enough?
The important question is this: how do we learn from our mistakes, and how do we say to ourselves, how can we be better next time? In 2010, I actually, with the Chinese Reconciliation Foundation, led a walk of reconciliation. We basically replicated the same group that committed this atrocious act, and we walked down Pacific Avenue to Ruston Way and basically said we walked in the reverse direction, trying to really reverse the pain and the heartache that that event caused.
We keep running into people that say, why bring up the bad past? Why bring up the... It's like, we're not talking about guilt. We are talking about a mistake that was made. We are talking about educating people so if they see symptoms of it, that it doesn't happen again.
This is a history that all Americans need to understand. If they know about it, if they know and understand it, they'll begin to see American immigration in a different light, and they'll begin to understand the kinds of disagreements, and really loud and angry dialogue that we're seeing today. I mean, this is a kind of resurgence of that same kind of nativism, fear of outsiders, fear of people who are taking their jobs, people of a different color, different religion. I mean, it's no different, and so it's been with us for a long time, and Chinese exclusion was the beginning.
Perhaps the most impressive effort to recognize and honor the Chinese can be found in Tacoma.
The Chinese Reconciliation Park is really a monument to what happened in the past, but also a signal that says it will never happen again. It sits on the waterfront, and it takes place around the same area where a lot of the Chinese residents were expelled. It's a beautiful park that has a bridge showing the bridge to the future. It has a ting, which is a building that was donated by our sister city, Fuzhou. Teresa Pan Hosley is a member of our community, and she has been working on the Chinese Reconciliation Park, I would say, for 20 years. A lot of what you see is a result of her hard work and her tenacity.
My main goal is to right a wrong and to bring the harmony to this community. We are all different in terms of our culture and our upbringing. What happened back then, I think because people did not understand Chinese culture, which is very different from American culture. And I thought, instead of put a plaque on the ground, I would like something more substantial and can bring people in, people from different community, people from all cultural background, to walk through, to learn the history, and so we together can learn from each other.
Watching the Reconciliation Park become more popular, more of a destination, and to come together is really exciting. But more than anything, it sends a message about our city. We will never repeat that type of mistake because Tacoma is an international waterfront city, and all people are welcome here from wherever you are.
Major funding for this program provided by the Russell Family Foundation. Additional support provided by the Bates Family Foundation and the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation, and by CHI Franciscan Health and the Multicare Health System, and contributions to KBTC Public Television by viewers like you. Thank you.